Welcome back to Coin Explorer Vault. What if a Washington quarter for 1994, a coin that may have passed through countless hands, grocery stores, cash registers, and family coin jars, could be connected to a claimed value of $154 million? The coin we're talking about is the 1994 Washington quarter, and at first glance, it looks like nothing more than an ordinary quarter from a familiar time in American life. But sometimes, the most fascinating discoveries are hiding in coins that nobody thought twice about. Imagine finding one in an old drawer inside a coffee can of change, or tucked away in a collection your parents or grandparents started decades ago. Would you spend it without looking twice? Or would you stop, turn it over, and ask the question every collector hopes to ask: could this ordinary-looking quarter be something extraordinary? Before we go any further, there is an important distinction. The $154 million figure is a supplied, unverified claim, not a verified auction result for an ordinary 1994 quarter. Real-world value depends on rarity, condition, authentication, varieties, errors, and documented market evidence. And that makes this story even more interesting because the real mystery is not simply the number. It is what could make a 1994 quarter truly special. To understand that, start with the date, 1994. America was in the middle of a changing decade, but the Washington quarter remained one of the most familiar pieces of everyday money. It could sit in a person's pocket while they stopped an old neighborhood store, dropped into a parking meter, or carried home alongside groceries. For many families, quarters were simply part of daily life. Some are placed in glass jars, some in kitchen drawers, and some disappeared into forgotten boxes that would not be opened again for years. That is where the story of a coin can become surprisingly personal. The 1994 Washington quarter was struck at the Philadelphia Mint, and the small p mint mark is one of the first details you should look for. Turn the coin to the reverse side and examine the area near the bottom, where the mint mark identifies Philadelphia. But that isn't the detail collectors notice first, because the date and mint mark only tell you what the coin is. They do not automatically tell you what it's worth. The next question is much more important: what happened to this particular coin after it left the mint? Think about how many quarters from 1994 entered circulation. Most experienced collectors know that ordinary examples are not automatically rare simply because they are several decades old. Age alone does not create a fortune. What can change the story is a combination of condition, error, variety, provenance, and collector demand. And this is where you should slow down if you have one sitting nearby. Look closely at George Washington's portrait on the obverse. Examine the lettering, the date, the rim, and the surfaces. Are there unusual marks that appear to be part of the minting process rather than ordinary damage? Does the coin show signs of doubling, an unusual strike, missing or distorted details, or another characteristic that deserves professional examination? Be careful, because damage that happens after a coin leaves the mint can sometimes look dramatic while having little numismatic value. A scratch, dent, discoloration, or alteration does not automatically make a coin rare. The distinction between a genuine mint-made error and ordinary damage can be extremely important. Now turn the quarter over. The reverse features the familiar American eagle design that made Washington quarters instantly recognizable to generations of Americans. Look around the rim. Check the lettering. Examine the eagle, the fields, and the overall strike. Under good lighting, rotate the coin slowly rather than rushing. Sometimes the smallest detail is the one that sends a collector back for a second look. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. Suppose your 1994 quarter looks unusually sharp. Perhaps the surfaces have very little wear. Perhaps the original luster is still visible. Perhaps the details appear exceptionally strong. That could make condition an important part of the investigation. Professional grading services evaluate coins according to standardized condition grades, and high-grade examples can be considerably more desirable than worn examples when the coin is otherwise scarce or has a recognized variety. But remember, a shiny coin is not automatically a high-grade coin, and cleaning can actually hurt a coin's desirability. Never polish a potentially valuable coin simply because you want it to look brighter. Collectors generally prefer original surfaces, and cleaning can leave permanent hairlines or other evidence of alteration. Now think back to the old coin jars many families kept. Maybe yours was a mayonnaise jar on a shelf, an envelope in a dresser drawer, or a small metal box filled with coins that nobody wanted spent. Perhaps a parent or grandparent would separate the older-looking pieces and say, "Keep those." At the time, it may have seemed like a simple habit. Years later, that little collection can become a fascinating time capsule. A 1994 quarter may not be ancient, but it still carries a snapshot of a particular period in American history. It passed through an America of pay phones, paper maps, video rental stores, handwritten checks, and shopping trips where a pocket full of quarters actually mattered. For an older collector, that history can be just as meaningful as the price. But if we're investigating the extraordinary $154 million claim attached to this coin, we have to ask a harder question. What evidence would actually be required to justify such a number? A genuine, extraordinary valuation would need credible documentation, expert authentication, and a market context that supports the figure. Without that evidence, the $154 million amount should be treated only as a claimed or hypothetical value, not as the normal value of a 1994p Washington quarter. In other words, don't look at an ordinary 1994p quarter and assume you found $154 million. Instead, use the claim as a reason to investigate the coin carefully. That is the difference between a collector and someone simply chasing a headline. The serious collector asks questions. Where's the coin found? Has it been professionally authenticated? Does it possess a recognized error or variety? What is its condition? Has anything been done to the surfaces? Is there documented market evidence for comparable pieces? The date catches your attention, but the real clue may be somewhere else. If you have a 1994p quarter, place it on a clean, soft surface and use a magnifying glass or a phone camera with good lighting. Do not scrape it, clean it, bend it, or attempt to repair anything. First, record the date and mint mark. Then inspect both sides carefully. Compare unusual features with trusted numismatic references, and if something genuinely unusual appears, consider having it examined by a qualified coin expert or professional grading service. That step can prevent a costly mistake, especially when the difference between a real mint error and post-mint damage is impossible to determine with the naked eye. And there's one more reason this particular year can be interesting. The coin is old enough now that many examples have spent decades circulating, being handled, dropped, stored, and forgotten. Every year that passes creates another layer of history. Somewhere, perhaps, a 1994p quarter is still sitting exactly where someone placed it years ago. Maybe it is in a collection inherited from a grandparent. Maybe it is mixed among hundreds of ordinary quarters. Maybe someone has carried it unknowingly for decades. Could one of those coins contain a genuine variety or error that makes it worth investigating? That is the question worth remembering, because the greatest lesson here is not that every 1994p quarter is a fortune. It isn't. The lesson is that valuable discoveries often begin with something ordinary, something people overlook because they have seen it 1,000 times. A quarter can be small enough to disappear in the bottom of a drawer, yet important enough to make a collector stop everything and take a second look. And if you have one, don't spend it before checking the date, mint mark, condition, and any unusual features. Keep your eyes open, because the next coin in our journey takes us to another familiar Washington quarter from a different year, and its story begins with a 1991 Washington quarter, a coin that may look ordinary in your hand, but raises another intriguing question about what collectors should look for before dismissing old change. So before you walk away from that jar of quarters, take one more look, because sometimes the coin everyone ignores is the one that starts the investigation. Next, Let's turn our attention to the 1991 D Washington quarter. Because there are moments when a coin's date seems ordinary, its design looks familiar, and its condition appears nothing special, yet one small detail can make a collector stop and look again. The 1991 D Washington quarter is connected to a supplied claim of $160 million, an extraordinary figure that must be treated carefully because it is not a verified auction result for an ordinary example. But imagine finding a 1991 D quarter in an old jar that has been sitting untouched for decades. Perhaps it belonged to a parent, a grandparent, or simply disappeared into a drawer after a trip to the grocery store. Would you recognize the clue that could make it worth investigating? Or would you place it back with the rest of your change and never know what you had? The story begins with a single letter D. That small mint mark tells us the coin was struck at the Denver Mint, but it does not, by itself, make the quarter rare or valuable. And that is where our investigation truly begins. The year 1991 takes us back to an America that many viewers remember very clearly. It was a time when coins still played an important role in everyday transactions, when people carried change in their pockets, and when children sometimes received a quarter as a small reward or allowance. A quarter could buy something simple, help pay for a newspaper, go into a vending machine, or disappear into the family coin jar at the end of the day. Those little pieces of change moved constantly from one person to another, and most people never wondered where they had been before. But every once in a while, a collector would take a closer look. The 1991 D Washington quarter carries the familiar portrait of George Washington on the obverse. Look carefully at the date, the lettering, the rim, and the overall strike. Then find the small d mint mark and confirm that it is actually present. That first inspection may seem simple, but it is important because collectors begin with identification before they begin talking about value. A quarter must first be correctly identified before anyone can responsibly determine whether it has something unusual. Now turn it over. The reverse presents the familiar eagle design that generations of Americans knew from everyday spending. Look at the feathers, the lettering, the rim, and the fields of the coin. Under magnification, examine areas where unusual doubling, striking characteristics, or other abnormalities might appear. But remember, not every unusual-looking mark is an error. A coin can become scratched, dented, stained, or damaged after leaving the mint. Those problems can sometimes look dramatic, especially under a magnifying glass. But post-mint damage is very different from a genuine minting error. This distinction is one of the most important lessons for anyone searching through old coins. The supplied $160 million figure may sound unbelievable, and without reliable documentation, it should remain exactly that: a claimed, estimated, hypothetical, or unverified value, not a promise that your 1991 D quarter is worth millions. The real value of an individual coin depends on factors such as authentication, rarity, recognized varieties or errors, preservation, grading, and actual market demand. In the world of coin collecting, a dramatic number can attract attention, but evidence is what matters. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because condition can completely change how collectors view a coin. Imagine two 1991 D quarters sitting side by side. They're the same year, the same mint, and essentially the same design. One has spent years in circulation, rubbing against other coins in pockets and cash registers. Its high points are worn, its surfaces are scratched, and its original luster has disappeared. The other may have spent most of its life protected inside a collection. Its details are sharper, its surfaces cleaner, and its original appearance much better preserved. To an untrained eye, they may seem almost identical. To a collector, they can tell two very different stories. Professional grading can help establish a coin's condition using standardized grades, but even a high grade does not automatically make an ordinary coin extraordinarily valuable. Rarity and demand still matter. So if you discover a 1991 D quarter in excellent condition, resist the temptation to immediately attach a huge price tag to it. Instead, treat it as a candidate for further examination. There is something almost romantic about that process, especially for those who grew up saving coins. Perhaps you remember a parent's sorting change after shopping. Maybe your grandfather had a small box where he kept older coins. Maybe there was a drawer in the house that everyone knew contained loose quarters, nickels, and pennies. Those collections were rarely organized like modern investment portfolios. They were simply memories stored in metal. And decades later, one of those forgotten coins can bring the past back in an instant. But that isn't the detail collectors notice first. The mint mark is only the beginning. Look at the coin's surfaces under good lighting. Tilt it slowly. Watch how the light moves across the fields. Examine the lettering and Washington's portrait. Then inspect the reverse. Are any details strangely doubled? Does anything appear unusually weak or distorted in a way that could suggest a striking problem? Is the rim consistent around the entire coin? Does the edge show anything unexpected? These observations do not prove an error, but they can tell you whether the coin deserves a closer professional examination. One of the biggest mistakes a new collector can make is cleaning the coin. If you find an old quarter that looks dirty, resist the urge to polish it. Household cleaners, abrasive materials, and even gentle-looking polishing cloths can leave marks that permanently affect the coin. Original surfaces are important, and once they are damaged, the original appearance cannot simply be restored. Instead, handle the coin by its edges and store it in an appropriate holder or protective environment. If you believe you have found something genuinely unusual, seek an opinion from a reputable numismatic expert. The date tells you what the coin is, but the condition and characteristics may tell you whether it deserves attention. And there is another question worth asking: where did your coin come from? Provenance can sometimes add context, particularly when a coin has been preserved in a documented collection or has an interesting history. Imagine discovering that the quarter you found in an old family box had been placed there 30 years ago by someone who simply thought it looked especially nice. The monetary value might be uncertain, but the emotional value could be enormous. That is why coin collecting has survived for generations. These pieces are small, durable records of everyday life. They pass through stores, restaurants, banks, pockets, purses, and family homes. They witnessed ordinary moments that nobody thought would become history. The 1991 D Washington quarter is therefore interesting not because every example is secretly worth $160 million, but because it reminds us to look carefully before making assumptions. A coin's extraordinary value, when it exists, has to be supported by extraordinary evidence. So if you have one, begin with the basics. Confirm the 1991 date. Confirm the D mint mark. Inspect both sides. Look for legitimate mint-made characteristics rather than damage. Evaluate the condition. Avoid cleaning. Compare the coin with trusted references, and if something truly unusual appears, have it professionally examined. Could your quarter be a rare variety? Could it contain a legitimate mint error? Or is its greatest value simply the story of where it has been? Until you inspect it carefully, you may not know. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes searching through old coins so fascinating. Somewhere, perhaps, a 1991 D quarter is sitting in a forgotten collection, waiting for someone to notice what everyone else overlooked. But our journey does not end here. In fact, the next coin takes us even farther back, to a year when the Washington quarter was entering an entirely different chapter of American coinage. Next, we turn to the 1965 Washington quarter, and this time, the date itself opens the door to a fascinating piece of American monetary history. Before you dismiss that older quarter as just another piece of change, remember what we have learned today. Sometimes the first clue is not the price. It is the history hiding underneath the surface. Next, let's turn our attention to the 1965 Washington quarter, a coin that may look like a simple piece of old American change, yet its year places it at one of the most important turning points in the history of the Washington quarter. A supplied claim connects a 1965 Washington quarter with a staggering $164 million value. But that figure is not a verified market value for an ordinary 1965 quarter, so it should be treated as an unverified or hypothetical claim rather than a guaranteed price. Still, there is a genuine reason collectors pay close attention to this particular year. In 1965, something fundamental changed in American coinage. A familiar quarter that generations had carried in their pockets entered a new era, and that change can be seen when you examine the coin closely. So if you have a 1965 quarter sitting in an old family collection, don't spend the next few minutes thinking about the headline number. Look at the coin itself, because the real story begins with what changed in 1965. Imagine opening an old box that has been sitting in a closet for decades. Inside are photographs, handwritten notes, perhaps an old watch, and a handful of coins someone saved without ever explaining why. Among them is a 1965 Washington quarter. You pick it up, turn it over, and suddenly you are holding a small piece of American history from a year when the nation's coinage was undergoing a major transformation. The Washington quarter had been familiar to Americans since 1932, but by the mid-1960s, the country was facing serious pressure on its supply of silver. Rising silver prices and increased demand for coins created a problem that could no longer be ignored. Beginning in 1965, the composition of the quarter changed. Earlier Washington quarters were made of a silver alloy, while the regular 1965 quarter was produced in a copper-nickel clad composition. That distinction is one of the first things collectors should understand. A genuine 1965 Washington quarter is normally a clad coin, not the traditional 90% silver quarter associated with earlier dates. And that makes this year particularly fascinating. Hold the coin by its edges and examine it carefully. Look at the edge. On a typical clad quarter, you can often see the layered construction, with a copper-colored core visible between the outer layers. That edge can provide an immediate visual clue about the coin's composition. But there is an important warning here: unusual color alone does not prove that a coin is rare, valuable, or made from the wrong metal. Surface discoloration, environmental exposure, damage, or other factors can change appearance. If you suspect an unusual composition, professional testing and authentication are far more reliable than simply judging the color by eye. Now look at the obverse. There is George Washington, facing left, exactly as generations of Americans remember him. The inscriptions surround the portrait, and the date 1965 sits near the bottom. Unlike earlier quarters, the regular 1965 issue does not carry a mint mark. That is another detail that can surprise collectors who are accustomed to looking for a small letter beneath the portrait. In 1965, the United States Mint was dealing with enormous demand for coinage, and coins were produced without mint marks as part of an effort to discourage collecting and hoarding during the coin shortage. That historical detail gives this quarter an identity far beyond its face value. It was born during a period when Americans were literally changing the way they thought about the money in their pockets. But that isn't the only reason the 1965 quarter deserves a closer look, because collectors know that transitional years can sometimes produce unusual pieces. When a mint changes composition or production practices, the possibility of unusual strikes, transitional errors, or other varieties can become an important area of study. However, we must be careful. It would be incorrect to claim that every 1965 quarter is a rare transitional error, and it would be equally wrong to assume that an unusual-looking coin is automatically worth a fortune. Genuine errors require evidence. A coin that appears different may have been altered after leaving the mint, damaged in circulation, or affected by environmental conditions. That is why serious collectors slow down and investigate rather than immediately believing the biggest number they see online. Now consider the supplied $164 million figure. It is an extraordinary claim, but there is no basis here to present it as the normal value of a 1965 Washington quarter. A typical circulated example does not suddenly become worth millions simply because it is from 1965. If an exceptionally valuable specimen exists, its value would need to be supported by specific characteristics, expert authentication, exceptional condition, recognized rarity, and credible market evidence. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because 1965 is not simply a date to circle on a coin. It represents a transition between two eras. If you grew up during this period, you may remember the change in American coins even if you never thought of it as history. Perhaps you remember saving silver coins in a jar. Perhaps a parent or grandparent would check change before putting it away. Maybe someone in your family kept older quarters because they believed silver coins should never be spent. Those habits became part of American collecting culture. For many people, a coin was never just money. It was something that could be saved for a rainy day, placed in a drawer, passed to a child, or tucked away because it seemed different from the newer pieces appearing in circulation. And decades later, those decisions can make an ordinary household drawer feel like a miniature time capsule. If you have a 1965 quarter, begin your inspection with the date. Confirm that it actually reads 1965. Then examine the edge. Does it show the expected clad construction? Next, inspect the surfaces. Look for unusual doubling, distorted lettering, unusual strike characteristics, or other features that appear to have originated during minting. Do not assume that scratches or dents are errors. A genuine mint-made error generally has characteristics that can be explained by the minting process, while damage can occur at any point afterward. If something looks unusual, take clear photographs under good lighting and compare it with reliable numismatic references. If the feature remains unexplained, professional examination is the safest path. The date catches your attention, but the real clue may be along the edge. That edge is especially interesting on a 1965 quarter because it can tell you something about the coin's composition. A normal clad quarter should show the layered construction associated with copper-nickel clad coinage. But if you encounter a coin that appears to have an unexpected composition, don't rush to declare a rarity. Composition claims should be verified with proper testing. A magnet, for example, cannot prove that a quarter is silver because silver itself is not magnetic. Weight can provide useful information, but even weight alone does not establish authenticity or a rare composition. Serious identification requires a combination of evidence. There is also the matter of condition. A coin that spent decades in circulation may show considerable wear. The highest points of Washington's portrait can lose detail, the fields can accumulate marks, and the reverse design can become less sharp. A well-preserved coin can tell a very different story. It may have spent much of its life protected in a collection rather than bouncing around in pockets and cash drawers. But again, excellent condition does not automatically equal extraordinary value. The market decides value based on rarity, demand, condition, and verified characteristics. That is why the responsible collector never begins with the price. The collector begins with the evidence. Think of this as a small investigation. You have a 1965 date. You have the lack of a mint mark. You have the clad composition. You have the historical transition. Now ask yourself, is there anything else unusual about this particular coin? Does the strike look normal? Are the letters properly formed? Are the rims consistent? Is the edge normal? Does the coin show signs of cleaning or alteration? Does it match known varieties? Each answer brings you closer to understanding what you actually have. And perhaps that is the greatest pleasure of collecting. You're not simply looking for money. You're looking for stories. A 1965 quarter may have traveled through a gas station, a department store, a family business, a school cafeteria, or a grandmother's kitchen. It may have been placed in a child's pocket, saved in a dresser, or